we really focused on, thank you, we focused on Davidson's early work, mostly the 1960s to the 1980s. We're going to talk a little bit more about that this time, partly because there are elements of that early work that we didn't cover last time, which I want to talk about. And that's really going to mean a focus on a topic that Davidson refers to as radical interpretation. And a lot of what I say will be about radical interpretation. So it won't quite be what I was originally envisaging for lecture 2. But that's only because I wasn't able to cover the radical interpretation material in the first lecture. And we will still, when we get to lecture 3, we'll still be talking about this broader context of Davidson's thinking and the connections to Heidegger, Gadamer, and to topology. Some of that will come out today, particularly the topological elements. So, in terms of the books, the books that are more important for this lecture are going to be the material in Inquiries into Truth and Interpretation and Subjective, Intersubjective, Objective. Particularly subjective, intersubjective, objective, because that really develops Davidson's work in new directions. But Inquiries into Truth and Interpretation is the volume in which most of the essays on radical interpretation appear. And that, as I said, is a lot of what I want to talk about today. So, now let me just go back. I'll just leave it on this one, because as I said, I want to do a quick recap of what we talked about in that first lecture. And if you remember, what I did was take you through 3 basic elements in Davidson's thinking: theory of action, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind. And in the theory of action, we talked about Davidson's claim that reasons are causes, why that's important, what that means. In theory of meaning, we talked about the way in which Davidson provides us with an account of meaning based in a truth-conditional semantic theory, essentially using Tarskian's formal definition of truth for a language as a way of providing a definition of meaning for a language. Now, I know some of you got a bit hung up, it seemed to me, on the distinction that Tarski introduces, which Davidson uses, between object language and meta language. And I just want to spend a few minutes just going over that again, because it's an important distinction, but it mustn't be overemphasized. So that distinction is not a distinction between 2 absolutely determinate systems. It's a correlative distinction. It's just a distinction that is employed by Tarski for the purposes of being able to allow the formal system to become an object of analysis. That's all. So, and anything can be a meta language with respect to an appropriate object language. The only requirement is that it have at least it has to have semantic resources that are at least as rich as the resources of the object language. And that's why English can be a meta language for an object language, which is also English. That's true for every natural language. It doesn't apply in quite the same way for formal languages always, although it could in some cases, but certainly it applies with natural languages. Every natural language can be its own meta language. So the distinction is not a metaphysical one, it's not ontological, it's just a distinction that's employed for the purposes of the analysis. But it does have some philosophical significance. And the philosophical significance is really about the shift to the meta level, to the self-reflective or to the self-reflexive level. That's what becomes philosophically interesting. And so the object level, meta level distinction is the distinction that relates directly to the possibility of self-reflection or self-critique or self-analysis, whether the analysis that takes place in a language or the analysis that we make of ourselves, or even the analysis that might be made of the world from within the world. So that distinction between object and meta language is important, but as I say, it shouldn't be overemphasized and it shouldn't be construed as somehow ontological when it's not. The third element, I think, that I talked about, theory of action, theory of meaning, theory of mind. and Davidson's so-called anomalous monism, according to which the mental and the physical really relate to the same thing, to the same particulars, the same events, but they describe them in different vocabularies. And so for Davidson, there is, in fact, while we normally talk about there being two vocabularies, the mental vocabulary and the physical vocabulary, sometimes Davidson talks about the mental vocabulary as a rational vocabulary. But he also said he didn't see any reason why we couldn't proliferate the number of vocabularies. So we could talk about the language of the ethical, for instance, as if that were another way of describing the world. So Davidson's a descriptive pluralist. He thinks there's one world, that's the monism, but there are lots of different ways of talking about it. And those different ways of talking about it usually relate to one another. That is, they supervene on one another. So what we say about, for instance, psychological or mental events ought to have some relation to what we say about the physical states that underlie those events, but they're not reducible one to the other. We can't get rid of the language of the mental and replace it with the language of the physical without losing something. So these descriptions, while they relate to one another, while they might supervene on one another, are not reducible to one another such that we could eliminate them. Now, all of the ideas that are at work in those three areas become more important or take on a new importance because they get brought together in different ways when we come to Davidson's thinking about radical interpretation, his thinking about knowledge, his thinking about rationality. But before we go on to that, any questions about that follow on from last week, or perhaps questions about that quick summary? I can't see anyone's hands shooting up. So in that case, let's get going on radical interpretation, lecture 2. So as I said, much of the material on radical interpretation can be seen as really part of the earlier thinking, the work from the 1960s to 1980s. And the key essays are all written mostly in the 70s. But radical interpretation is, if you like, the gate that opens up Davidson's later thinking for a number of reasons, and we'll see what some of those reasons are in a moment. So where I want to start talking about radical interpretation is via Davidson's theory of meaning. So if you remember, Davidson develops this theory of meaning based on the idea that you can use a task in truth theory. And the theory of meaning is going to marry up sentences in the object language with sentences in the meta language. So it's going to give the meaning of particular sentences using a formula or a model that goes, S is true if and only if P. Snow is white is true if and only if snow is white. We can say snow is white if and only if snow is white. The is true doesn't. It simply allows us to confirm that the first sentence is in fact being asserted in some way. So now, as I said before, one of the problems that's sometimes raised against this sort of meaning theory is that it will sometimes allow, because it just requires truth equivalence and truth values. Sometimes you will get the pairing of sentences where meaning isn't completely preserved. One example being snow is white is true if and only if snow is white and grass is green. Okay, truth value is the same on each side. There's a truth value equivalence, but there's a difference in meaning. Now, as I said before, there are ways around this within even a straight formal approach, because there are constraints within tasking, particularly the compositionality constraint, which says that the elements of the sentences, you have to be able to build up your truth conditionals on the basis of the elements of sentences. So that means there's a compositional requirement. You have to be able to build up these sentences from smaller components. And that's not going to allow you to just bring in arbitrary elements. But a truth theory, a meaning theory rather, is also an empirical theory. It's a theory about language. And so it ought to be sensitive to the empirical evidence. And that requirement allows us to bring in another set of constraints, empirical constraints, that are additional to those that we find in tasking and provide a way of, as it were, weeding out the sentences that don't really work, that don't really give us equivalences of meaning, even though they seem to give us equivalences in truth value. And so a sentence like snow is white is true if and only if grass is green, if that's intended to be a sentence that tells us the meaning, then it won't work very well as a sentence for an empirical theory of meaning, because of course we'll get some speakers who will dissent from that claim. We will say snow is white and grass is green, and they'll look at us puzzlingly and say, yes, but snow is white. We weren't talking about the grass. Okay, so radical interpretation is an enlarged version, if you like, of Davidson's approach to meaning, which now embeds meaning within a larger theory about the way in which language is actually used. This is interesting because you might argue that this is an indication of Davidson's, ultimately his Wittgensteinian background and Wittgensteinian sympathies. Even though he's trained largely by Quine, he spends a lot of time engaging with Wittgenstein and with Wittgensteinians. And there are a lot of Wittgensteinian elements in Davidson's thinking. I remember once at a seminar in Berkeley, Davidson was asked what was his view of Wittgenstein. What did he think of the investigations? Well, said Davidson, I try to reread the investigations at least once every couple of years, just to remind myself of what's important. So he had a lot of respect for Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein plays a really important role in the background of his thinking, even though there's probably only one essay, that's the social aspect of language use, I think it's called, in which Wittgenstein is specifically referred to. So radical interpretation is really an approach to, it takes the task in account, but it now embeds it in terms of the way the speaker is operating in the world, okay? And so you might say this is going to be one of the areas where Davidson starts to look a bit closer to Heidegger, because Davidson doesn't think that you get speakers other than as they are engaged in the world. He doesn't use the language that Heidegger uses, but nevertheless, there's something like that. And this idea, this what I would call both a holistic and an externalistic idea, that speakers have to be understood as they are in the world, that becomes a crucial element in a lot of Davidson's subsequent thinking. It's not necessarily a sudden new introduction into his thinking, because I would argue it's there from the very beginning. But it becomes very, very clear in a way that it wasn't before when Davidson starts talking about radical interpretation. So what is radical interpretation? Well, it's an idea that Davidson first introduces in an essay in 1984, Belief on the Basis of Meaning. There are elements that predate it earlier, but Belief on the Basis of Meaning is the first key essay in which this is developed. Now, radical interpretation is an idea that essentially comes out of Davidson's engagement with Quine. In the late 50s and early 60s, Davidson had a position at Stanford. And around that same period, in the late 50s, Quine was spending a lot of time at Stanford. And he and Davidson spent a lot of time together, right? As I think I've already said, Quine was a huge influence on Davidson during his postgraduate years. It was Quine's influence that really shifted Davidson's interest away from the history of ideas, away from the sort of influence of Werner Jaeger and Whitehead to some extent, and towards a more analytic frame of mind. And Davidson and Quine spent a lot of time talking about issues related to language, meaning, and understanding around topics in relation to the sorts of topics that appear in Word and Object, Chapter 2. And if you haven't read Word and Object, go and get a copy and read it, because it's one of the key works of 20th century English language analytic philosophy. And in particular, read Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is as much Quine as much Davidson as it is Quine. In Chapter chapter 2 of Word and Object, Quine develops this idea of radical translation. Now, radical translation is modeled on the idea of an anthropologist finding himself in an unusual country, an unusual place, among people whose language he or she does not understand. This is the situation of the field linguist, if you like. And the field linguist, the anthropologist, has the problem of interpreting the native utterances, the utterance of the people who live in that place. And maybe the language they use is completely unrelated to any previous language. So the interpreter, the field linguist, can't presuppose, let's say, some other language that he or she already knows. It's a bit similar to this language. It's a completely alien language, completely new situation. How does the field linguist, how does the anthropologist come to understand the language? Now, we know from actual cases like this that it's possible to do it. But how do we do it? And how do we theorize the way we do it? Well, Quine argues that the basis for being able to interpret, being able to translate an unknown language, has essentially, well, one basic step, first of all, and this is a step that Davidson also takes up. We have to be able to identify instances of assent and dissent. Davidson talks about identifying instances of holding true. That is, we need to be able to tell when a speaker is asserting something and when they're dissenting from something. Okay? Now that, Davidson and Quine both assume that we can do that. You might think on the face of it that that's too big an assumption. But both of them are really thinking of the interpreter, the linguist, the anthropologist, as engaged with people in the world and very often involved in common actions with them. So they're trying to do things together. Okay? And in that situation, you can start to see how it might well be the case that, since I'm host, I think I get to admit people. I've just had a message come up, so I've admitted somebody. So you can see how, in that situation, it's not just some purely theoretical situation. It's a situation in which we're engaging with individuals, we're engaging in relation to objects and so on, and it's not far-fetched to suppose that we can get some sense of when they are dissenting or assenting. We may not be clear about what it is they're assenting or dissenting to, but we'll get some, that we can at least identify cases of assent as dissent. Now, Quine has this imaginary example. We're walking with our new friend whose language we don't really understand yet. We're walking across a field, and suddenly what we think is a rabbit runs past. Gavagai, says our friend. What did he mean? Or what does she mean? Gavagai. Well, Quine says, well, it looks like Gavagai has some relation to the rabbit. A rabbit, or, and Quine considers various other possibilities, there goes an undetached rabbit part. Because Quine uses this example to show that we can't be sure from the beginning even what the ontological commitments of the speaker are. Do they think of the rabbit as an undetached rabbit part? Do they think of it as a rabbit? Do they think of it as something else? Now, Quine thinks that there's an indeterminacy about this, that there's always going to be some sense in which we won't be able to specify exactly what the ontology is. And that leads to a position called ontological relativity, which Quine discusses in other essays of his. From Davidson's perspective, what this problem of interpretation is about, the fact that we initially don't seem to know what it is that the speaker's referring to, even though we think it's got some connection to a rabbit. One of the things that shows for Davidson, and this is endorsed by Quine as well, is that meaning and belief are connected. To be able to interpret a sentence, you need to know what the beliefs are. And to know the beliefs, you have to know the meaning. I'll come back to that in a moment. Both Quine and Davidson think, however, that the evidence on which you make an interpretation or you attribute a meaning or a belief has to be evidence that's publicly available. Sometimes this is said to be a behavioral assumption. To some extent, that's more true for Quine than for Davidson. Both of them will say the evidence has to be publicly available evidence, behavioral evidence, but it just means publicly available, particularly for Davidson. It has to be evidence that you and I can both agree on. Okay, so Quine is a bit more behaviorist on this than Davidson is. Davidson thinks the range of publicly available evidence is actually quite large. Unlike Quine, Davidson, however, focuses on when the two of them are both interested in what beliefs utterances are about. But Davidson thinks that the things we have to take as the objects and the causes of belief and utterance are what he calls the distal objects, the distal causes, rather than the proximal causes. Distal just means at a distance, proximal just means close to, proximate to. Quine thinks that really when we talk, when we have beliefs, what we're really referring to are what he calls patterns of sensory stimuli. Okay, so he's a thoroughgoing empiricist about this. Davidson thinks when we talk about things, we have beliefs. What's really at issue are things out there in the world. Okay, so you and I see the rabbit, we both have beliefs about the rabbit. We might describe the rabbit differently, but in some sense, we're talking about the rabbit. We're not talking about patterns of sensory irradiation of the retina, for instance. That's a really important point of difference between Davidson and Quine. It's a point of difference that is sometimes not paid attention to. Doug Finn-Follersdale, for instance, tends to underestimate it. Davidson always regarded Doug Finn's reading of his work as much too Quinean and not paying attention to these sorts of differences. But notice what's important here. Both Davidson and Quine think that there's this problem of translation or interpretation. Translation is Quine's term, interpretation is Davidson's. And both of them think of this as a problem about how we are in the world. It's not a problem about some sort of internality. It's a problem about what's publicly available. It's a problem about how we engage with others. Quine has a narrower view of what the world is because he thinks it's patterns of sensory stimulation than does Davidson. But there's something similar that both of them are committed to. So radical interpretation is Davidson's idea, but it's a continuation of Quine's notion of radical translation. What's the difference between them? Well, it's quite simple. Davidson says that, well, a theory of a translation doesn't have to be in a language that you understand. So you can have a translation from, let's say, Swahili to Iroquois, an American Indian language. Probably nobody who's listening to this lecture knows Swahili or Iroquois, in which case it's a translation, but it's not very helpful to us. An interpretation, Davidson says, is always into a language you understand. So an interpretation that gives us the meanings of the terms in Swahili, in Russian, or in English, that's an interpretation because it's a translation into a language you understand. And ideally, Davidson says, it ought to be a translation or interpretation that gives you some insight into the structure of the language as well, so that you can understand other utterances on the basis of that utterance. Now, radical interpretation begins with this problem that I alluded to before, which is that beliefs and meanings are interdependent. What we take to be, what beliefs we're going to attribute to somebody depends on how we interpret their utterances, what meanings we assign to them. What meanings we assign depends on what their beliefs are. Now, on the face of it, it looks like there's no way of sorting that out because we can't get at beliefs if we don't know the utterances. We can't get at the utterances if we don't know the beliefs. It's actually a really nice example of a certain sort of hermeneutic circle. How do we get into it? How do we solve the problem? Well, Davidson will argue that the interdependence is both the problem but also the solution. An interpretation is made possible, firstly, by being able to identify those instances of holding true, by being able to identify esoteric utterances or instances of assent and dissent, and secondly, through the employment of what Davidson calls the principle of charity. And the principle of charity is a principle that says, assume that your interlocutor's beliefs are for the most part true, which according to Davidson means that the beliefs of your interlocutor are mostly in agreement with your own beliefs. Why associate truth and agreement? Isn't that a bit parochial? Isn't that a bit prejudicial? Well, not really, because most of us assume that most of our beliefs are true. That's what it is to hold a belief. To hold a belief is to hold something true. So if I believe something, I believe it to be true. And if I have a whole lot of beliefs, which I do, then I have a whole lot of things that I think are true. So if I say I'm going to assume that your beliefs are mostly in agreement with my beliefs, that means I'm going to assume that most of your beliefs are true. By my lights, of course, but nevertheless, I'm going to assume most of them are true. So the principle of charity just says, assume that most people believe that like you do. Now, the principle of charity doesn't say, and leave it there. Don't go any further. It says, you've got to assume that. And at the very least, that is a necessary starting point. If you don't assume that, you can't get anything. So you assume that most of the beliefs that you and your interlocutor, the guy you're trying to interpret, most of their beliefs are the same as yours. That means you've got a way into the circle of belief and meaning, because you already know what some of the beliefs are, or at least you can make some reasonable supposition about what most of those beliefs are. And Davidson always modifies or qualifies the principle of charity. So assume that most of the beliefs of your interlocutor are true or in agreement with your beliefs, depending on other factors that we already know about. So you might already know that your interlocutor has, I don't know, maybe weird beliefs about cheese that you don't believe, right? He believes that, or she believes that cheese is, I don't know, is mined in the mountains of Slovakia. You don't believe that. They do believe that. It turns out that you can put that to one side, or maybe not so easily. Maybe it turns out to be a really important belief. But anyway, so generally speaking, you assume that most of your beliefs are in agreement, most of them are true. So you can fix belief, and on that basis, you can start to interpret. Because if you assume that when your friend yells "Gavagai" as the rabbit runs past, that your friend has similar beliefs to yours, beliefs about what that is, about why you might be interested in it, and then you can start to identify utterances. You can say, look, a rabbit is probably what he or she is saying. What do you do then? You test it out. The next time a rabbit runs past, you say "Gavagai." And your speaker not, your interlocutor is clearly excited and seems to be agreeing with you. Or maybe they look puzzled. "Gavagai?" Not at all. Okay, so interpretation is always for Davidson a dynamic process. It's a dialogical process, but it begins with this idea of agreement. Now, next time I'll come back to that, because that turns out to be an interesting starting point in relation to Davidson's connection to Gudham. But I'm going to leave Gudham to one side for the moment. So this is where the possibility of interpretation really lies. It lies in this assumption of agreement. Now, there are some other things at work there as well, like the holding true and like the fact that a Tarskian truth theory requires a certain underlying logical structure. The point about logical structure is quite significant because to some extent that's elaborated further in Davidson's discussions about rationality. But this idea of agreement seems to me really fundamental, really important. And in a way, it's a development of that idea that you can only get at meaning, you can only get at belief by thinking of speakers and yourself as an interpreter as already out there in the world. So Davidson's interpreter is not somebody who's sitting there independently of the people who he or she is trying to interpret and simply taking a set of utterances and then trying to match them up as if he or she were using some kind of phrase book. They are actively engaged with the speakers whose utterances they want to understand and who beliefs they want to identify. And so it's an active involvement. Very often, speakers and interpreters will be involved in common projects. And so they will be trying to do things together in some way. So there's this very strong sense, it seems to me, in which Davidson's analysis of radical interpretation takes the theory of meaning away from just an abstracted scientific analysis out into the world and says, if you want to understand what meaning is, you've got to think about speakers and interpreters as in the world. You've got to think of them as making utterances about the world, and you've got to think of them as having beliefs about the world, and not just beliefs, but a whole range of what Davidson will call propositional attitudes. Propositional attitudes just being any attitude that takes a proposition as its object. So propositional attitude typically is an attitude that involves some sort of that clause. I fear that a tiger will eat me. I believe that the earth moves around the sun. I hope that tomorrow will be fine. I desire that I get a pay rise. Okay, so these sorts of attitudes, the attitudes that connect to meanings, they connect to meanings because they have content, and the content can be specified using a sentence or proposition. And it's this notion of content that becomes very important. Now, Davidson doesn't think that radical interpretation is just a peculiar thing that we only do when we're being anthropologists or field linguists or when we're in a foreign country. He thinks that interpretation, radical interpretation, is domestic as well as is a domestic issue as well as a foreign issue, as it were. In fact, he thinks that we're always involved in some form of radical interpretation because we can't always assume anything about what somebody means. I mean, conceivably, somebody could be using some bit of language in a completely new way that we've never encountered before. In which case, we can't just rely on some existing practice or existing mode of behavior to interpret that utterance. That idea that we are always in a position where we could be confronted by radically new uses of language is something that becomes very important in a paper that's become rather notorious, a paper called A Nice Derangement of Epitaphs, which takes its title from a phrase that's used by Mrs. LaTrobe in a play by the English playwright Sheridan, 18th century playwright. Mrs. LaTrobe gives her name to malapropisms. A malapropism, well, an example of a malapropism is a nice derangement of epitaphs. Mrs. LaTrobe actually means to say that's a nice arrangement of epithets, a phrase that might be just as obscure to some as a nice arrangement of epitaphs. But a nice arrangement of epithets would be a nice arrangement of phrases that relate to, that describe somebody. Okay. A nice arrangement of epitaphs, it's sort of a bit funny. It's intended to be funny. Sheridan's plays are comedies. But you can see that what Mrs. LaTrobe does is mix up. She gets the words wrong in sort of funny ways and in ways that are not disconnected, but she gets them wrong. And that sort of mixing up of words is called a malapropism after Mrs. LaTrobe. How do we know? How do we understand a malapropism? Because lots of malapropisms we've never encountered before. There are lots of examples of unusual uses of language like that. Another one is the example of spoonerism. You have hissed my mystery lectures is a classic spoonerism. There is a rule that underlies spoonerisms, usually swapping around the first consonant. So it's a bit easier to understand them. But the first spoonerism, people understood, and yet they'd never encountered it before. So that's a nice example of a case where the problem of radical interpretation can arise at home in a fairly radical way, as well as away from home. The way Davidson uses that in a nice range of epitaphs is to argue that all linguistic understanding is like that. All linguistic understanding has to be prepared to take on new utterances, sometimes because people are being deliberately obscure, sometimes because they make mistakes, because their spoken English, their spoken language is usually stumbling, often not complete, often not grammatical. How do we make sense of language when it's not grammatical, when there are strange new uses of words, when people use words in funny ways, when they forget what they mean and think they mean something else? Well, if you think that language and linguistic understanding is just a matter of mechanically applying theory, you can't explain it. And so in a nice range of epitaphs, Davidson argues that, well, yeah, theories of meaning can have some role to play, but what's crucial to the possibility of understanding is something that we can't actually give in the form of theory. It's a matter of being able constantly to adjust ourselves to new and very often strange modes of speaking. As it were, it's a matter of being able to accommodate ourselves to the constant breakdown of language and its reformation. Now, at that point, of course, one can start to see how Davidson's thinking is going to connect up, not just with people like Gadamer, but also with Derrida. And in fact, Davidson declares in a nice range of epitaphs that there is no such thing as a language. At least not if by language you mean a structure, a determinate linguistic structure with a specified semantics and syntax which everybody follows and which no one deviates from, because there isn't such a thing as that. Languages are much more complex, dynamic, much more indeterminate than that. Now, that idea is a direct outcome of Davidson's thinking in relation to radical interpretation, even though for many people it was a bit of a strange thing for Davidson to say. But it comes out of the earlier work quite straightforward. What this sort of thinking embodies, however, is the idea is a fundamentally holistic view of language, of meaning, of belief, of the mental, if you like. So meanings are always dependent on other meanings. Now that's semantic holism. That's an idea that's already there in a Tarskian truth theory. Meaning depends on belief. That's actually an idea that Davidson gets, you might say, from Quine. Beliefs are dependent on other beliefs and on desires. Again, that's something that's in Quine, although it's also there in Frank Ramsey's work in decision theory, which Davidson was interested in that very early work that I mentioned last time on probability. So all of these things are connected, okay? Belief with meaning, or meaning with belief, belief with desire. It's a single structure. And not only that, but you can't have a single meaning. You can't have a single belief on its own. So Davidson used to say, look, to have one belief is to have many beliefs. And we might say, too, for there to be one meaning is for there to be many meanings. You don't just get a single utterance bereft of any connections with other potential utterances. Utterances belong to languages. Now, that commitment to holism is really fundamental in Davidson's work, and it has all sorts of implications. In fact, one of the implications is something I'll talk about a little bit in a moment, and that is something called externalism. Because Davidson's commitment to holism, Davidson himself tended to think of externalism and holism as if they were two separate commitments. I tend to think they're one. I remember putting that to Don and found that he certainly didn't demur it. What's externalism? Well, externalism is an idea that is, since Davidson first wrote, has really been taken up within cognitive science, for instance, in terms of 4E cognition, for instance, the idea that cognition is something out there in the world that's tied to action, to embodiment, and so on. That's one of the ways in which externalist thinking is developed. Externalism is just the view that the real objects of belief are the causes of belief. So beliefs are to be understood in terms of what's out there in the world, not in terms of some inner meaning that somehow resides inside consciousness or whatever. Okay, so externalism is a view that really puts the mind out there in the world in some sense. And Davidson is an externalist. His externalism, though, arguably follows from his holism, because his holism connects up beliefs and meanings, and it connects up belief and truth. And in doing so, it becomes almost impossible to pull belief or meaning away from the world. Just to try and illustrate that, there was one occasion where, because when I used to visit Berkeley, I would visit both Bert Dreyfus and Don Davidson. Bert Dreyfus one time got very interested in the problem of realism and anti-realism. And he took Davidson as his example of, well, he thought he was a problematic realist. And so he wrote a paper that was critical of Davidson on this matter, but he never showed it to Don, despite the fact that Bert had an office one floor above Bert's. Don was not happy about this. So I suggested we all have lunch together, which we did. And at lunch, both Don and I were bemused by Bert Dreyfus insisting that, well, realism was all about one thing. It was about the independence of the world from language. How is the world to be independent from language? It's not clear how that can even be specified. Even to specify is to use language. And language is also something in the world, right? It's words, spoken words, amongst other things. So language is part of the world. How can the world then be independent of language? That's not a claim that can even be properly formulated. Now, Davidson and I took that not to show that realism is in some sense incoherent, but rather that realism understood in terms of a sharp bifurcation between world and language makes no sense. Dick Rorty would insist that for that reason, Davidson and I should give up on realism, and we sort of did, at least the word. But we didn't necessarily give up on the idea that our beliefs and our language, our meanings, are connected, they're part of the world. So we would still hold to a certain sort of realism, just the same sort of realism Heidegger holds to, namely that we are in the world already, that there's no separation between language and the world, no separation between belief and the world, that they're already in the world before we can even start thinking about them as possibly being apart from the world. And that's a direct consequence, it seems to me, of holism. It's an externalist position, but it's also a consequence of this idea that belief, meaning, language, the objects of belief, they are all tied together. Now, holism brings with it another consequence, and it's a consequence that's already there in Quine. I referred to it briefly in talking about word and object, and that is the idea of indeterminacy. So Davidson thinks that meaning, belief, desire, content is always indeterminate. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that there's nothing true that you can say about content. What it means is that the trouble is there's lots of true things you can say. For something to be indeterminate for Davidson doesn't mean there's no true thing you can say about what we believe, for instance. It means there's always more than one true thing you can say. In a way, this is a sort of correlate to Davidson's claim about plurality of description. Just as descriptions are plural, so it means that interpretation is always plural. There is always more than one correct way of interpreting. There's always more than one correct way to assign meanings and beliefs. And that's because they're holistic. Because what you've got to do is be able to make, a good match in terms of the overall structure. But that means you can assign the individual bits in lots of different ways, so long as you keep the overall structure more or less the same. So the constraint is at the level of the whole, less than it is at the level of the individual attributions. That idea of indeterminacy, I think, is actually extremely important. It's crucial in Davidson's thinking. but I also think it's an important element in thinking elsewhere. It's fundamental, I think, in phenomenology and hermeneutics, even though it's very often not recognized. And again, I'll say more about that when I talk in the next lecture. Now, do I have another slide? Yes, I do, because there's one other topic that I want to talk about a little bit. Actually, two other topics, but we'll see. And the other topic I want to talk a little bit about is this idea of rationality and irrationality, because part of what Davidson's committed to is an account of rationality. And this is something that he writes quite a lot about. Some of his early essays in the 1970s, Is Weakness of the Will Possible? How is Weakness of the Will Possible? Comes from 1970. There's a string of essays that he writes on this problem of irrationality, sometimes expressed in terms of the question of weakness of the will, or akrasia, which is the Greek term. What is weakness of the will? Well, weakness of the will is best understood by using some examples. You've decided that you're going to go on a diet, but when you front up in the university canteen, you see there's a very nice cream cake sitting there, and you decide, and you think, well, I'm on a diet, but I'm going to have the cream cake. Now, that's an example of weakness of will. You have made a decision not to do something, but confronted with the temptation, you just turn out to be weak, or that's what we might say, and you give in. Now, in a sense, this is the case of irrationality, because you have a reason not to eat the cream cake, and you've said you won't eat the cream cake, but then you do. This is irrational. So Davidson tries to look at cases like this and explain them. Now, it has to be said that Davidson has what's often called a thin theory of rationality. That the idea of thick and thin comes from John Rawls's work. Rationality for Davidson simply requires a commitment to overall consistency and coherence. It doesn't require that you abide by a specific set of logical rules, although usually some of what consistency is going to be able to be specified more formally. But it's overall consistency and coherence. And that's always something that you're working out rather than fully realizing. Beliefs and desires and utterances don't form a single system that's complete at a time, and which therefore has to be completely consistent and coherent at a time. They're just partly because they're indeterminate systems. So you can't really specify completely what the entire system of beliefs is. So beliefs, attitudes, content is dynamic. It's always in the process of being worked out, but it is constrained by this requirement of rationality, this requirement of coherence and consistency. Why? Well, for a very obvious reason, because remember, the content of beliefs depends on the connection to other beliefs. If you don't have connections to other beliefs, or if those connections are inconsistent or break down, you're going to lose content. And we can think of examples to demonstrate this. If somebody says to you, I'm on a diet, but they show no sign of actually changing their food habits, they just eat whatever, and you say to them, but you're on a diet, and they say, yeah, that's why I eat all these cream cakes. You say, so it's a cream cake diet. Oh, no, you say, it's not a cream cake diet. I also like to fly airplanes. At that point, we might start to think they understand diet differently. If these sorts of weird connections proliferate, so they start telling us other strange things, then we might start to wonder whether they're actually saying anything at all, whether this isn't all just nonsense. So that if the connections between beliefs and desires, between beliefs and utterances, between utterances start to break down, we lose a sense of there being anything meaningful at all. And so rationality is just this idea. It's just a version of the commitment to wholeness. It just says, yeah, beliefs and desires ought to connect up. They ought to be integrated in some fashion. Because if they're not, we lose any sense of what they're about, of what their content is. Content is fundamentally rational, not in the sense that it has to have good reasons, but just in the sense that it has to connect. So then, of course, the question is, how is irrationality possible? Because there do seem to be cases of irrationality. Sometimes we do weird things. And Davidson points out that, well, the reason for this is twofold. It's partly because the mental is both a causal and a rational system. And sometimes causal factors impact on our beliefs and utterances in ways that, as it were, jar with the rest of our beliefs and utterances. So in the most extreme cases, the cases of psychological disturbance, where some problem in the brain and the nervous system gives rise to beliefs or desires or actions or utterances that don't fit with the other beliefs, desires, actions, or utterances that belong to a person. So sometimes it's just there's a causal element that's just intruding on the rational system. Usually when that happens and we recognize it, we try either to resolve it or we find it quite bothersome. Okay. And sometimes we just have to say, look, I'm just doing that. I'm sick, or I can't help it. So we just treat that particular instance as something that doesn't fall into the normal rationality of the mental, the normal integration of the self. But the other reason, that it's the other factor that explains irrationality, is simply the fact that our mental lives are always to some extent partial and incomplete. Our attention shifts. We do one activity, then we do another. So there are all sorts of things that lead to the mind or the life of the mind being what Davidson calls weakly partitioned into different territories, different localities. This is actually a very interesting idea from my point of view, because it's an indication of the way in which Davidson starts increasingly to introduce what I think of as topological ideas into his thinking, and start to understand the mind in terms of different localities or different localizations, and to think of belief and meaning and desire and all the other attitudes and so on as themselves constituted in terms of different localities. So in my first book, which was actually on Davidson, I talked about the mental or the psychological being holistic, but the holism being a localized holism, the holism being mitigated by a principle of locality that says, well, beliefs and desires form themselves into sort of clumps. It's not just one big interconnected system. It's a lumpy system. It's a system in which some beliefs and desires are more connected to one another than they are to other sets of beliefs and desires. And that's how we get this partitioning. Very often, when we recognize the clumping, we then start trying to sort it out and resolve the tangle. But we don't always do that. So what I've taken you through this time are just a few ideas that start to become important in the later Davidson. One is this idea of radical interpretation, which is going to develop into something much, much more. Because in fact, radical interpretation becomes for Davidson the basis of something he calls triangulation. And I want to talk more about triangulation next time. Triangulation is the idea that, if you like, knowledge and content is always a matter of the interconnection between knowledge of self, knowledge of others, and knowledge of the world. And that's going to have all sorts of interesting connections for a range of different topics. So radical interpretation gives rise to this, or commits Davidson, expresses this commitment to holism. It also involves this commitment to indeterminacy. Beliefs, desires, meanings, attributions of content are never such as to determine a unique attribution. There's always more than one way of describing, of interpreting. And holism is also tied up with this idea of externalism, the idea that we are out there in the world and that beliefs and desires and attitudes are not some sort of inner state completely severed from the outer. That is something, again, I want to talk about more later on, because it's expressed in terms of this idea of triangulation in some very interesting ways, and leads Davidson, for instance, to reject the possibility of skepticism as basically a notion that cannot be made sense of. Perhaps not in ways that are not dissimilar to some of the problems he has with certain sort of realist positions. And then this idea of rationality, which is really a development of the idea of holism, and that involves this commitment to thinking of the mental as an integrated but imperfectly integrated system. Now, all of these ideas are going to lead Davidson in some interesting directions that will allow his thinking to converge, and this should already be evident with the thinking, particularly of hermeneutic philosophers such as Gadamer, but also with Heidegger. And I think there are very important connections between Davidson and Heidegger. There is one other topic that we will need to talk about next time, and that I haven't had enough time to talk about thus far. That is the concept of truth. We talked about that a little bit in relation to Tarski and the way Davidson used the theory of truth from Tarski as the basis for a theory of meaning. But truth becomes a very important concept for Davidson because he thinks truth is fundamental to language, fundamental to the possibility of propositional attitudes. And yet he also denies that truth can ever be given a full account of. He thinks truth is in some sense a fundamental, but ultimately unanalyzable concept. And in this respect, he connects with Heidegger on what is perhaps one of Heidegger's most important points as well. And that is the idea of truth as what Heidegger calls aletheia or unhiddenness. And there's something like a similar concept of truth in Davidson, although I'm probably the only one who's really argued that point. So it's almost 8 o'clock and I've talked for more than the 45 or 50 minutes that Emil normally gives me. So I better shut up and see if you've got some questions. And I'll stop screen sharing as well. So, and I'm hoping you could all hear me this time. I know Dennis said there were some problems with my mic last time, but I've been fiddling with it a bit. I hope it was better.
You can hear me now, Jeff?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, so I've reclaimed host. So, any questions?
I have 2 questions.
Okay, go ahead.
I have 2 questions.
Yep.
So the first is like a clarification question about externalism. So
About, say that again, about?
Come closer, Sikia.
About externalism.
Oh, externalism, yeah. Sorry, because you're in the room, there's a bit of echo.
Oh, sorry. I see. So is it correct that Davidson is externalist in a sense?
Yes, yeah. And he uses the term quite often. He has an essay called Epistemology Externalized, and he used to joke. Someone at a conference once asked him how long had he been an externalist, and his reply was, "Well, I've been an externalist since 1963. It was Quine who converted me to externalism, and I've been trying to convert Quine ever since." It's a joke. But it's supposed to indicate how long-standing Davidson's commitment was. And also this idea that, well, Quine was really an externalist, even though he didn't admit it. But anyway, sorry, I'm interrupting.
No, it was fine. Good remark, I see. Okay, but my question is about is externalism entails that there is some meaning in reality? It doesn't entails realism, that which kind of is a source of all the meanings that we have.
There's a couple of things to say about that. As Davidson gives a very succinct definition of his externalism in A Coherence Theory of Truth and Knowledge. He says, basically, the causes of belief are the objects of belief. So if you want to know what somebody is thinking about, find what it is that's causing them to think in that way. So the causes of beliefs are the objects of belief, the distal objects of belief, okay? So they're the real world objects. Now, that means that Davidson doesn't think, and Davidson doesn't think there's such a thing as an inner subjective realm, which is just meaningful in and of itself. He thinks meaning is, if you like, the product of being in the world. So it's not that meaning is out there in the object or in here in us. Meaning is what happens when you get language users in the world, right? Now, I'm sympathetic to the view that meaning is out there in the world already, but I'm sympathetic to that view simply because I think language is already part of the world. And interestingly, for Davidson, I think, and this is something I was going to talk about next time, language is not subjective, language is objective. Language already belongs to the world. Very Heideggerian position as much as it's a Davidsonian position. So when you ask that question, does externalism mean there's sort of meaning out there in things, in the world? That's sort of, the answer has to be sort of yes. But the question also seems to be mistaken in some sense, as if, well, where else could meaning be? Meaning arises only through our interaction in the world. We need both the world and language. That's where meaning comes from. The other thing I would say about that, though, is that I think certainly, I think Davidson is somewhat suspicious of meaning as we often use it. And I am too. I think we use meaning, but we really have no idea what we mean by it. So when Davidson talks about meaning, he means linguistic meaning. He means the sort of meaning that can be specified using, well, roughly something like a Tarskian truth theory. It's truth conditions. That's what meaning is. So Davidson never uses, occasionally he might use it colloquially, but when he's being careful, he doesn't use meaning in the broad way that we often do. You know, do you have a meaningful life? Is there meaning in the world? Well, in a certain sense, we don't know what those sentences mean. We sort of know, but we also don't. So meaning as identical, and notice if we say meaning is truth condition, then, well, are truth conditions out there in the world? Do they belong to things? Well, sort of, yes. But it's harder to think of truth conditions as not being connected to the world, because truth is surely connected to the world. So simply understood, externalism is just the idea that the mental realm can't be made sense of independently of the situation, the worldly situation in which mental states are embedded. That's the simple idea. And if you want, you can say, as Hilary Putnam said, that therefore meanings ain't in the head. This was Putnam's famous phrase. Meanings ain't in the head. Meanings are out there in the world. So Putnam would have answered your question with a resounding yes, meanings are out there in the world. I'm being a little bit more equivocal because I think there's one sense in which that's true and another sense in which it's the wrong question to ask. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
Yeah.
Come have a seat.
Okay, so it's more of a clarification question, I think, but from what you said, I got that while interpreting, we not only assign meanings, but assign beliefs. And as I thought that we assign those beliefs to even be able to assign the meanings further, right? So
yeah, you're still echoing a bit. Just say that again slowly.
okay, so while interpreting like some text or some speech, you said that we do not only assign meanings, but we also assign beliefs. Do we do this to even be able to comprehend meaning, or does it have some does this have to do with this principle of charity, perhaps? That without assigning beliefs, you wouldn't be able to understand what the sentence actually means.
So you've got to think about what we do when we assign meaning to an utterance. So somebody says something. Now elsewhere, Davidson talks about something which he calls first-person authority. His reading of first-person authority is that when someone makes an assertion, then they know what they mean by that assertion, and they're asserting a belief that they hold. They're holding something true. So any assertion is by definition the expression of a belief. So that's where you can see the connection between meaning and belief. Now, Davidson thinks assertions are the primary unit of they're the primary linguistic units. They're the primary things on which language operates: assertions, assertoric sentences, statements. So that means that beliefs also play a really fundamental role in language, because most of our sentences are either assertions of beliefs or they relate to some sort of belief. So that's where the connection between meaning and belief begins. And it's a completely unsurprising connection. It's not that we've got meanings and then we've got beliefs. As soon as we've got meanings, we've already got beliefs. As soon as we've got sentences, rather, we've already got beliefs. So now, can you just restate where you wanted to go from there?
I don't think I want to go anywhere with this. I actually didn't quite understand how, I didn't quite understand the connection firstly. And I just wanted to clarify whether it's like on this charity principle, whether this interpretation always should be based on charity principle, but I actually got the answer from what you said.
Yeah. So the principle of charity, and Davidson stops you talking about it as the principle of charity in the later thinking. It's only in the earlier essays. If we understand the way belief and meaning are connected, so that when I say something, I'm already either expressing a belief or what I say connects to a belief. So if you and I are both in the world, we're both talking about similar things, and I want to work out what you're saying, then I have to assume that most of your beliefs, not all of them, but most of them are the same as me. That's all the principle of charity says. Assume that most of your interlocutor's beliefs are in agreement with yours, which is also to say that most of them are true. So in a way, all the principle of charity is doing is saying, assume both of you are in the world and you're both oriented to a similar set of things because you're talking to one another, right? And now this is what becomes in later Davidson triangulation, because you can already see there's a triangle there. There's you, there's me, and there's something we're talking about, we think. Okay, and so what I can do is use the beliefs that I have in order to triangulate. That is to try and work out what your beliefs are, so that I can try and work out what the object is that we're both talking about. Or I can use the object plus my beliefs to work out what your belief is. Okay, and once I've got the beliefs, I can also start to attribute meaning and everything else. So the principle of charity is it comes out of this idea that belief and meanings are connected. And it provides, in a way, the principle isn't anything other than just a restatement of the fact that beliefs and meanings are connected. That's all it is. And if they're connected, then you can use one to get at the other. Even though it seems as if, the real problem is such that you don't know either of them. But you do know some, because you know what your beliefs are. And from that, you can get to the other person's beliefs. Now, the principle of charity often gets criticized because people misunderstand what the principle is. They think it's Davidson being just assuming a Western sort of bourgeois set of beliefs. But he doesn't say what beliefs you have to assume, right? All he's saying is, when you say something, you are asserting a belief. And when I try and understand what you're saying about something, the only thing I've got to use are the beliefs I have about the thing that you're talking about. And because we're both talking about the same thing, we should be able to work out, we should be able to triangulate one another, position one another in that way. And so that's how the principle of charity is working in relation to that interdependence. And I probably still haven't caught your question properly because the sound is really awful, but I'm hoping the sound is better from your end than it is from my end. So if I've misunderstood what you were asking, I'm blaming it on the speakers.
I think you only partially misunderstood, but I think I got the answer from you.
Okay, good.
So thank you.
Yeah, can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, I can hear you. It's just that there's a bit of distortion. It could just be, the problem could be my poor hearing, because I get a lot of because I'm so deaf in the upper frequencies, I just get distortion in the upper frequencies. And because this tends to be, you know, the sound tends to be big on upper frequencies rather than lower frequencies.
Well, that's
I need
okay.
I need you all to be speaking in very low voices.
Okay, I need to read out a question from one of the participants, but they don't have a mic, so I have to read out the question to you.
Yep, that's okay.
All right, so why was Davidson skeptical about the swamp man's ability to have meaningful utterances? Did he embrace a sort of dualism that implied that an ideal physical replica of a person would lack some kind of first-hand experience that would warrant its ability of recognition?
Okay, swamp man example, somebody who's read some Davidson. The swamp man example is interesting. Davidson once said of the swamp man, he said there are two examples that he wished he'd never invented. One is the omniscient interpreter example, which we haven't talked about. The other is the swamp man example. The swamp man example has become rather notorious. So for people who don't know, Davidson says, and he regrets inventing this, remember, right? So he says, well, imagine that one day Davidson happens to be walking through a swamp as a bolt of lightning hits a nearby rotten log, immediately killing him, Davidson, but transforming the rotten log into an exact physical replica of him, who then carries on and starts walking around talking about radical interpretation and seeming to be identical to the original Davidson. Question: does the swamp man Davidson, do his utterances have any meaning? Does he have beliefs or attitudes? And Davidson says, what do you think he says? Some people obviously know. He says no. The swamp man does not have thoughts and his utterances are meaningless. Now, Davidson's answer to this is, Davidson's answer is actually quite complicated. Most of the time, people just focus on what Davidson initially says, which is, at that moment when the swamp man first appears, meaningless utterances, no beliefs, no desires, nothing. There's nothing going on. Why? Well, because meanings, utterances, and beliefs depend on a context of meaning, utterances, and beliefs. And that includes a historical context. There's no history to the swamp man, right? It's just like suddenly something appears and says, hi. Without a history, it's meaningless. Now, Davidson goes on to say there's nothing to stop the swamp man gaining a history. So over time, maybe we would decide the swamp man's utterances do start to have meaning, that the swamp man does have beliefs. But at that initial moment, there's nothing there, right? Davidson used to say of his examples, or at least I remember him saying once, only pay attention to what's important about my examples. Don't pay attention to the relevant points, okay? This is partly what got him into trouble with Swamp Man and the Omniscient Interpreter, because he wasn't that interested in how other people might develop the example. And John Searle really wanted to develop the Swamp Man example in ways that Davidson wasn't interested in and didn't think had anything to do with what he originally said. The Swamp Man example is just intended to show that beliefs, meanings, attitudes depend on being connected with other beliefs, meaning, and attitudes, and that includes a history of meanings, beliefs, and attitudes. And if you don't have that, you don't have the right connection and you don't have content. That's all that there is to the Swamp Man example. And Davidson, as I said, regretted having invented it. He said he wished he'd never thought it up. So it's an example that people make more of than Davidson actually intended. So in some ways, it's better to forget about the Swamp Man and just focus on this point that Davidson wanted it to illustrate, which is that beliefs, meanings, desires form holistic systems, and they're holistic across time, not just at a time. So you need a history. Without a history, you've got no meaning. Again, I think this is a point that nicely connects up with both Gudde and Heidegger. But that's the real point of the swamp man example. So hopefully that answers the question. So Dennis, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Good talk. So I have actually two questions, one quick follow-up, and well, another one is about conceptual scheme. So the quick follow-up would be like, so considering, so like imagine that there used to be the swamp man, I don't know, from the creation of Earth, of like, you know, in whatever kind it might have happened, right? So like, could we then, well, come to the conclusion that the swamp man could be actually speaking meaningfully, because say like, you know, the swamp man, yeah, did exist like, I don't know, for thousands of years, or like maybe there is a community of swamp men, I don't know, some swamp people and so on and so on. Can we say that, or is this, well, would be an exaggeration?
Well, if we say that, we've got a different example from the one that Davidson gives us, right? I mean, you can do with the swamp man whatever you like, but the point behind Davidson's use of the example is really limited. It's just beliefs, desires, meanings belong to context, and that context is historical. It's not just at a time.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That's all Davidson intends by it. I mean, that means if you want, you can imagine that there are communities of swamp men and swamp men who've lived for hundreds of or thousands. Fine. It's just that Davidson will say, so what?
Yeah. Yeah, and so yeah, my main question is about yeah, conceptual scheme. So what do you hold on Davidson's decision to this problem about the third dogma and so on and so on?
Yeah.
Well, so I'm a bit puzzled, because on the one hand, so he seems to have brought up well, good examples and good arguments against the idea, and still well, well, it's hard to give up the idea of well, belief systems perhaps, or like conceptual schemes that are so different that they cannot be well, made compatible. So I don't mean to say that we cannot translate from one to another, because I think that we can, or that we are able indeed, well, to conduct the translation, but yet well, maybe it's not the only way to define a conceptual scheme. Maybe
So
like
this,
yes,
yes.
sorry.
So this is something that I was going to talk about more next week, and I will.
Okay.
But the conceptual scheme issue is related to what we've been talking about today, because fundamentally Davidson's objection to the idea of a conceptual scheme is the same as his objection to the idea of the mental as some inner private realm. So what the rejection of conceptual schemes is really about is it's a rejection of the idea that language and world, conceptuality and world, are two separate things, right? If they're two separate things, says Davidson, they're never going to come together, right? And you can't make any sense of them if they're two separate things anyway. So on the very idea of a conceptual scheme is not intended to be an argument that shows you can't use the idea of a conceptual scheme in some loose sense. Yeah, so people have a whole lot of ideas that they think that fit together and are very different to the ideas that this person over there has. In that loose sense, yeah, of course there are conceptual schemes, but it's not a very precise nor an especially interesting idea. First of all, Davidson's focused on a very specific development of this idea and certain very specific instantiations of it. So one is the untranslatability idea, the idea that there can be languages that are not translatable. No. Davidson thinks that makes no sense because the only genuine criterion of languagehood can be translatability. That forms a little argument of its own. If you think languages and conceptual schemes are the same, then if there are no untranslatable languages, there will be no incommensurable conceptual schemes, right? And that's, you know, you can see both the Kuhnian argument that he's attacking there, also the Quinean argument, because Quine sometimes seems to hold this, as well as the sorts of ideas that you find in linguistic relativity in the work of people like Benjamin Lee Wolf and Edward Sapir, for instance. Now, Davidson's also concerned, and there's also an argument he has about, as you say, the third dogma and exactly how this idea of alternative conceptual schemes comes up. And so there are various more technical points about that we don't need to go into. But Davidson's real concern is just this idea that there is a separation between language and world, conceptuality and world. The way he expresses that in a later paper, so there's a second paper called The Myth of the Subjective, which basically recasts the argument of the very idea as what it really is, which is a rejection of the idea that the mental forms an inner private realm. Okay? So for David, and this is tied up with Davidson's externalism, if you like. There aren't conceptual schemes because there's no internal, purely private realm. There's no internalism. There is only an external perspective. So languages, utterances, beliefs, concepts are already tied up to the world. So they can't organize the world. They can't have this schematic role in relation to the world. We can't make any sense of that. As I say, that doesn't rule out the idea that there might be sort of, in some vague sense, bodies of beliefs that, you know, we don't share with other people and they have to. Notice, though, also the way in which the principle of charity plays out here, because if it's the case that in order for us to be able to attribute contentful beliefs and so on to other people, most of our beliefs have to be true, then the idea that there could be radically different conceptual schemes is going to make no sense either, because that would seem to suggest that there will be whole systems of belief that will be completely different. And again, that doesn't make any sense. Because for the most part, when we do talk about differences in conceptual schemes, we really only mean differences at the perimeter, at the periphery. So we say, you know, X and Y have completely different conceptual schemes, when what we really mean is, oh, they have completely different views about the nature of science, or they have completely different views about politics or some particular domain. But do they still go to the shops? Do they still know that Paris is the capital of France? Do they still live in the same world? Well, pretty much. I mean, that means that Davidson, for instance, would very often say, when people put to him this idea that there really are radically different conceptual schemes, he'd say, really, what do you mean by that? Give me an example of the sort of radical difference that you're talking about. And people would then say things like, oh, well, what about the fact that people used to think that the earth is flat? Well, said Davidson, leave out the fact that that isn't historically true necessarily. What did they really believe when they believed that? Did they believe that the sun doesn't come up the way? What? I mean, to all intents and purposes, most of their experience of the world will have been the same as ours, right? So there are all sorts of problems around that, the way in which we talk about conceptual schemes, and the idea that, you know, this is an obviously true claim that there are such things. I think we can only think that because we fail to pay attention to what might really be involved in the notion. And that's partly what Davidson is doing, as well as which there is this larger, more fundamental claim he's making about the impossibility of separating off language from world in the way that any thoroughgoing conceptual scheme would require. So most of the, I mean, I have read so many supposed refutations of Davidson, right? And they're typically refutations that proceed on the basis, they more or less proceed as follows. Davidson must be wrong. Why? Well, because we know there are conceptual schemes. Davidson says there aren't conceptual schemes, so he's wrong. That's it. That argument then proceeds, then is backed up by saying, because we can imagine some alien race who has a completely different conceptual scheme from us. Well, can you? So I'm frankly often amazed by the sorts of weak arguments that philosophers are willing to put forward about this sort of stuff, because they're usually really, really weak, and they almost always beg the question. And most of the time, people haven't stopped to think about what they mean. There was there are some good discussions of conceptual schemes. So Stefan Kerner, the Kant scholar, has a very good and interesting discussion of the nature of what he calls conceptual schema or schemata, which is a bit more nuanced, partly because it's coming from a Kantian perspective. And there was a really interesting debate between Kerner and Eva Schaefer, another very well-known Kant scholar from an earlier time, around just this question as to whether or not we could make sense of radically different conceptual schemata from within a Kantian perspective. And interestingly, Schaefer ends up using arguments very like Davidson's. From a Kantian perspective, there's a little bit more content you can give to it. And I think part of the problem in a lot of the Davidsonian discussion, or the discussions of Davidson, is that most people haven't really thought about what they mean by a conceptual scheme. And so they both want to reject Davidson's view, but really what they're holding on to is a fairly weak and vague notion of what a conceptual scheme is, of a sort that isn't touched by anything Davidson says. He doesn't care if you want to keep you talking about conceptual scheme in some sense. He just wants to take issue with the idea that there's any really philosophically substantive meaning to be assigned to it. You want to use that as a way of talking about the fact that people have some different beliefs? Fine. But that's not very interesting. So.
Yeah, thank you. So actually, I have some more questions about that, but yeah, Emil meant that we are running out of time, I guess. So.
Well, quickly, if you've got a quick question, put it.
Well, I think that there are more substantive. I mean, like they could use a lot of time. So I guess we.
Yeah. Well, we could have a more substantive discussion later. But if you haven't read it, have a read of Davidson's paper, "The Myth of the Subjective."
Yeah,
that would be,
thank you.
Yeah.
And can you please give the name of these other guys that you've mentioned, like Stephen Kerner?
Stefan Kerner. Stefan Kerner has a book called, or a paper called Categorical Schema. I'm just going inside because my battery's getting a bit low. So I just need to plug in. So Stefan Kerner was a Kant scholar writing in English. His surname is spelled Korner.
Yeah, it's a German name, umlaut.
Yeah. There's an umlaut over the O. You'll find his category, I think it's called Categorical Schemes. That's his main book, but he also has a paper on the idea of categorical schemata. Yeah, he talks about categorical schemata and conceptual schemata. I should have made that clear.
All right, thank you. We'll call it there. Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you everybody for coming.
All right, well, thank you. And I've only just noticed